Alright, a few people have asked me to make a video about pendulum painting and how you do it, how it's done. It's pretty simple, but a couple of pointers to help you avoid all the mistakes I've made and save you a ton of time. What you've got are caulking, empty caulking cartridges. It's really nice because once you clean them out, it's got a perfect nozzle. You can cut the tip the size you want. The setup has a million variations. That's the problem. The way I've done it, I usually just use one. I actually mounted a syringe on the bottom from work. But the hole I've come up with is usually about 1 to 2 millimeters in width. If you go bigger, you end up with a huge puddle in your painting. If you go smaller, it tends to drip and then ruin your painting. Although sometimes the drips are cool. There's, again, endless variations. I have used just a big chunk of cedar wood for a weight. Early on, if you watch some of my videos, you'll notice that the pendulum goes really slow because I didn't have enough weight and the paint was so thick it was literally dragging it and stopping it. It was so viscous. So the weight, this isn't very heavy, a couple of pounds, but it's enough to keep it swinging. I just drilled a couple of holes through the top, tie my string on there. I've actually used some very thin nylon rope. I think this is actually parachute cord. You can get it at Home Depot. Big spool of it for super cheap. You don't want your rope too thick, otherwise it won't swing nicely. If it's too thin, it's a pain. So I like this. It's reusable forever. Paint viscosity is a big deal. The whole acrylic pouring community has educated me on how they use Floetrol. I'm sure you've seen that before. Simple stuff, super cheap. The Flood Floetrol, it's like 10-15 bucks for a gallon. I mix my paint now about 50-50 paint and Floetrol. Sometimes I add a little water. One of the problems with this is it has to be perfectly mixed. You get one little chunk in there, one little bit of, sometimes the Floetrol comes and there's little globules in there, little chunks. It'll clog your nozzle and you ruin your painting. So you have to get it mixed really well. I use a power drill. I don't have it up here with one of my wife's whisks to mix my paint perfectly. But each color, each manufacturer has a different consistency of their paint. So basically, it takes a lot of experimenting. You just fill up one of your nozzles, hold it up, and it just needs to drip really smoothly and evenly. One of the tricky parts is that the more paint you put in a nozzle, the faster it flows because the weight of the paint pushes it out faster. And then when it gets to the end, it slows down because you don't have very much weight of paint pushing it. So there's a lot of variables here you try to control. I'm going to start using a taller nozzle or a bigger one so I can get more consistency as it swings. So that's about it. Putting different colors in is tricky. I started using multiple nozzles so that I could have simultaneous patterns. You could do one at a time, but it's hard to get the same pattern at the same place because the way you throw it determines everything, and that's hard to reproduce. So that's been fun. If you're putting multiple colors in the same nozzle, that's tricky because what I have discovered is the first color you put in coats the outside of the nozzle, and as the other colors, even if you stack them, as you put them in there, there's different layers of colors. The first one you put in there is going to coat all of the others, and so all you'll see is that color sometime. So one trick I discovered is I took some non-stick spray and put it in there between each color, and that actually helped divide them out. It helps the paint slide in there so it's not coating everything. So I do a little coat before I should put any color in and then between each layer. And so that gives you an abrupt change as the pattern is formed from color to color. Still experimenting with it. That makes it a little runny, so you have to be careful. Maybe make your paint a little thicker to begin with. But just some thoughts. When I first started, I just put 10 colors in here, and it actually turned out pretty cool. You get some cells forming and unexpected spirals of pattern, and it's really just how the paint funnels through. And I guess that's what I've discovered with acrylic painting is that you just kind of run with it, and unexpected things happen all the time, so it's kind of fun. All right, so here's my setup for pendulum painting. First of all, you got to steal your kid's playroom, and you have to have a wife that really loves you, so you can put holes in the ceiling or be more creative than me. This is a messy process, so I put down drop cloths everywhere. I had a box made. Actually, I made a box a few years ago doing sand pendulum stuff, and I use it to test out patterns before I do my paint, so I don't burn through so much paint. So I'll pull the drop cloth off, test an idea, and then put it back down and do my painting. So the box has been handy to corral all the paint that just goes everywhere. This is pretty rudimentary, so don't laugh. I've got a ladder here and an old cabinet with a bucket on top to get to the right height. I taped a big pole I had laying around across the top. This is about 5.5 feet tall from the ground up. When you're making different spiral patterns, I have 3 basic setups, and I'm sure there's more out there, but the one that's my favorite, if you look up one of my YouTube videos, it's called Big Red, Dan Priest, D-A-N-P-R-E-E-C-E. I used this setup. Essentially, I just draped a cord over the pole. I found that actually matters. If you hang your string straight down, if you just tied a knot around this and hung it straight down, you'll get a spiral, which is cool, but you won't get that really interesting pattern of the diminishing spiral. I don't even know how to describe it. I'm sure some mathematician out there is laughing at me, but check out Big Red. That's one of my favorites. This is the setup I used for that. If I'd gone higher up to the ceiling, I would have had a much more intricate pattern. Each time the pendulum swings around, you lose momentum. So the higher your pendulum, the more layers of patterns you're going to get. So that's something to think about. But this was plenty high for that painting. I think that painting was 4 feet by 4 feet, so it's not exactly tiny. So that's the first setup. Again, you have to drape it over something like a little pole. If you don't, you'll just get spirals. I can still get a spiral on this if I throw it just right, but a lot of times you get the diminishing pattern spiral that's pretty cool. You can actually see it in the sand here, one of my test runs. So it's got a pretty unique pattern to it. Other setup on the ceiling here is this black, it's actually Velcro strips, but you can use whatever you want. They're really intricate patterns. If you look at one of my videos, it's called the Blue Web. There's infinite numbers of patterns you can get by hanging a rope from a loop. And by that I mean, so here's my loop, big old loop up here. And then if I hang my rope from here, right in the middle, and tie it off, that does a couple of things. That means that when it swings back and forth, if it's going in the same direction as this loop, it can only swing a certain distance. If it's swinging the opposite direction, it can swing all the way from the ceiling, if that makes sense. So basically you've got two axes, whatever you call it, of motion, and that allows it to create a pattern. The height of the loop makes a huge difference. That's where your infinite patterns come from. You'll notice that I'm hanging it from a very tight rope up there. It's hardly a loop at all, and that gets me some of my favorite patterns. The looser the loop, the more different the pattern. So it just depends on what you want to do. I've gone all the way through all these iterations, hanging the rope from the loop all the way down, and from just a few inches off the ground. Oh, by the way, this ceiling's about 9 to 10 feet high, I think. So you can get a whole bunch of patterns depending on how high the rope is hung from that loop. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, here's my pendulum setup where you're hanging the pendulum from a loop. I thought I'd better demonstrate this a little more appropriately. So ignore those two lines over there. That's nothing to do with it. It's just the two coming down here from corner to corner. I'm probably, I don't know, 5 feet apart at the top. It's hanging down 4 or 5 feet, and then from the loop it's another 4 or 5 feet down. That distance isn't critical. You could go a lot smaller than this. This is just the space I have to work in. But what is important is where on the loop you hang the rope. I mean, how low you hang the loop. So I could have tightened this loop up to be much higher, and the higher I go, the more the pattern changes. I'm going to go about halfway down on this one. It gets a funny pretzel type pattern. I haven't done a painting yet. I'm going to do one later today with that, I think. But you can adjust that loop from ceiling to floor and come up with just a ton of different patterns. They're all derivations of each other, but it's interesting when you get past certain points, all of a sudden the pattern changes to something unique. So have fun with that. My third option is to hang my pendulum from the ceiling just in a straight line, nothing fancy. And then I'll put my canvases on my turntable down here and let it do a lot of the work. I did a bunch of paintings that way, which were pretty interesting. And that has infinite variations, excuse me, depending on how and where you put your canvas. So I've got a lot of videos out there. You can see all of this in action. setup I've got is just a straight hanging rope from the ceiling. It's just hanging from an eye hook from the ceiling. Again, your wife better love you, otherwise you're in trouble. That's just for straight pendulum, simple spirals, nothing too exciting there.
Lots of toys, all for the little ones' Christmas joys. Ho, 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 who wouldn't go? Ho, 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 who wouldn't go? Up on the housetop, click, 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 down through the chimney with good Saint Nick. Thank you.